Myers is a quality project leader at Tufts Medical Center. In this role, she works with teams throughout the medical center to improve the quality and safety of clinical care. She is primarily responsible for regulatory readiness and pay-for-performance programs, including electronic clinical quality measures. Prior to joining Tufts Medical Center, Lynn worked in critical care, nursing management, case management, risk management, and quality management in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Lynn earned her BSN from Northeastern University and her MBA from Salem State College. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean, for that very nice introduction, and welcome to all of our listeners. Our objectives today are, number one, to really define what a diagram is and talk about why and when you could use it, and then we'll talk about actually creating a driver diagram. I first want to start with a fundamental concept in process improvement, and that is that certain inputs executed in certain ways will result in certain outcomes. The process outcomes are a function of key drivers. We cannot directly control outcomes. We can only control inputs. This leads to our theory of improvement, that changing the inputs will change the outcomes. So a driver diagram is all about changing the inputs. A driver diagram is really a simple visual tool that can assist you in systematically planning and structuring your improvement project. It will help you understand the logic of your project and where you're going with your improvement initiative. It really represents the team's current theories of cause and effect in the system. What changes will likely cause the desired effects? It sets the stage for defining the how elements of a project, that is, the specific changes or interventions that will lead to the desired outcome. A driver diagram describes the relationship between an aim for improvement and change ideas to make that improvement, and we're going to see that in action. A driver diagram really helps to translate a high-level improvement goal into a logical set of related goals and sub-projects. The tool helps organize change concepts and ideas as a team answers the question, what changes can we make that will result in an improvement? Creating a driver diagram is most useful in the initial planning of a performance improvement project or initiative, but it is a tool that should be updated regularly as the team refines their theories of cause and effect. It also helps in defining which aspects of the system should be measured, and we'll be talking about measurement quite a bit nearer to the end of the presentation. There are lots of reasons to use driver diagrams. They can be used to generate ideas, and we want the team to be as open as possible to many ideas. And one way to do that is to use brainstorming techniques. We're not really this isn't really a program on brainstorming, but again, that's a big way of getting your team involved. They can visually display the components of a system and the relationships between them, and help the team to understand how individual change products can help achieve a larger aim. The driver diagram can also be used to communicate your project and the design of your project to a wider audience because it actually is a nice visual and easy to understand. I did want to mention the silver bullet thinking. That, as H.L. Mencken said, goes to the theory that, as he said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. You want to be careful not to assume that there's a simple answer to any problems. And again, the driver diagram can do that by helping to encourage a wide range of solutions. You want to avoid blind spots in thinking, and again, this is by encouraging new ideas for change, identifying gaps in idea generation, and helping the team to explore all of the factors that might impact an aim. When we talk about the ability to survive failure and the unexpected, one of the advantages of having a driver diagram is that if one test of change fails or doesn't produce the desired effect, you can go back to the driver diagram and choose another improvement idea from that same category. And again, as we talked about, it can help you share the learning across your organization. So the steps in building a driver diagram are essentially, obviously, to start with getting the right people in the room, defining the aim, identifying primary and secondary drivers, identifying your change initiatives, defining measures, and then prioritizing your activities for your PDSA cycles. And we're going to talk about each of these steps in more detail as we go through the session today. The first step is to define your aim. An aim is, so driver diagrams want to start with a clearly defined and measurable goal. An aim is the clearly articulated goal of the work. It describes the desired outcome. It should be measurable, specific, and time-bound, and should answer the question, how much improvement, for whom, and by when. Remember, we want to talk about SMART goals or SMART aims. It should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. As Don Berwick says, some is not a measure and soon is not a time. So a simple aim statement might be, I want to lose 10 pounds by July 4th. How much by when? A very specific amount and time frame. When determining a target for an aim, your team must decide how ambitious it should be. While there's no correct answers, there are some guidelines. You want the aim to be bold but attainable. It should create a focus and a sense of urgency in the organization, but it should always be realistic based on what the evidence says is possible. You don't want to set an aim that everyone on the team knows is impossible. That really prevents people from buying into and actively participating in the improvement project if they feel a sense of failure before they even start because the aim just isn't achievable. There are some common errors in selecting projects to start with. You want to select a project that people are interested in, that in terms of common errors in selecting projects include selecting projects that no one is interested in, selecting a solution instead of a problem to investigate. And again, the driver diagram can help you really focus on moving to solutions instead of starting there. And you want to watch the scope of your project. You don't want it to be too big. If you have a very large project, it is possible to create multiple driver diagrams that are nested one within the other, which is beyond the scope of this talk. So after we have our aim, the next step is to identify the primary drivers. These are sometimes referred to as key drivers, and they are high-level system components that contribute directly to achieving the aim. This slide says your primary drivers 3 to 5 main areas. I would actually try to keep it closer to 3 than to 5. If you have too many primary drivers, you might want to look at regrouping them. Maybe there's a way to combine groups. You'll just get sort of bogged down in maintaining a diagram rather than actually moving towards improvement. So, for example, in order to lose my 10 pounds by July 4th, there would be essentially 2 primary drivers for that, to reduce caloric intake and increase caloric use. And they are referred to as the primary drivers because they drive the achievement of that main outcome. Then we would identify secondary drivers. They're the components necessary to achieve the primary drivers. This secondary level articulates the structures, processes, and norms that can be acted on when introducing new ways of doing things. So it might be creating a new process, introducing a new tool, and including changing the culture or changing norms and behaviors. To have an effect on these primary drivers, we need to carry out these clearly defined actions. In my case, I might, in order to impact the primary driver of reducing caloric intake, I might need to eat lower calorie food, eat more fruits and vegetables or something like that. And to increase caloric output, maybe I want to join a Zumba class or take a spinning class or take the stairs instead of the elevator. So those might be my secondary drivers. The arrows always point from right to left to indicate the cause and effect. Most times, secondary drivers, as you can see here, will have point to one primary driver. Again, if they point to more than one primary driver, you may need to look at your groupings and put them together in a little way. Each driver should be able to be measured, as we've talked about a little while ago, and most drivers should align with specific process measures. Step 4 is to identify change ideas. The secondary drivers are used to identify these change ideas, and then these change ideas then need to be tested in order to affect the primary drivers. Change ideas are tangible and specific. Changes should be measurable. The team wants to answer the question, which driver does this support? Again, when we're doing a brainstorming session and talking about changes, we can then ask, as we go through it, which secondary driver does this impact? Interventions can be best practices approach that have already been developed and tested, like bundles of care, for example, or corrective actions to address gaps in approaches that you've previously tried, new technologies, proven improvement concepts such as waste elimination, workflow improvements, reduction in variation, or creative approaches, anything that the team can come up with to make changes in the system. Finally, you define measures or metrics that the team will use to assess the impact of the various parts of your plan over time. A driver diagram will help define which aspects of the system should be measured to see if the changes and interventions are effective. And it's essentially about identifying whether or not the underlying causal theories are the inputs affecting the output are correct. Measurement is critical to any improvement project, as you all know, since all improvement requires change, but not all change is an improvement. So we need to measure that. You're going to look at both process and outcome measures. Your aim will almost always be measured by an outcome measure, and then the secondary drivers in particular can be process measures. And you can annotate your driver diagram with your measures, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Your process measures will be impacted first, and once there's sufficient impact, you'll start to see changes in your outcome measures. You also might want to think about selecting a balancing measure so that you can watch for any unintended consequences in your tests of change. We're going to start with the fishbone examples from last month's webinar and create driver diagrams from them. Fishbone diagrams represent the team's theories about what is causing an effect. They account for the present situation. So you'll remember this diagram from last month. We just started with a simple example of the car won't start. If we take that fishbone diagram and create a driver diagram from it, the driver diagram represents the team's theories about what changes will result in improvement. They justify action. So you can see here, we've started with our aim. The car is going to start, and we have an outcome measure attached to it. That's the percentage of time the car starts on the first attempt. Then we have our primary drivers here in this column, and they have measures as well. We put those in a little oval right beneath it. Some people just put it in the same box in a different colored text or something like that. And then the secondary driver. So when we say the car is going to start, if we look back at, I'm just going to go back here a minute. If we looked back at our fishbone diagram, one of the things was it was out of gas. So one of our drivers is that the car must have gas. And then we're going to develop a secondary driver, which is to keep the gas tank full, and then change concepts, which would include getting the gas gauge fixed and filling up the tank when it reaches a quarter full, and developing a habit of checking the gas gauge every time we're starting the car. Sometimes teams will work backwards from change concepts. You will always want to start with your aim, and you should be able to start with primary drivers, but sometimes teams will have trouble developing secondary drivers. And in that case, it sometimes helps to get the team to start talking about changes. Then you can group the changes into a secondary driver that they would impact. It is also possible for change concepts to impact more than one driver. So you can see here we've said that checking the gas gauge every time you start the car not only impacts keeping gas in the car, but it impacts the operator knowledge and maintenance. This is, as you remember from last month, a clinical example of a fishbone diagram, and the problem was inadequate communication via the nurse call system. So then our driver diagram turns that into a positive statement, and our aim is adequate communication via the nurse call system. And we look at our primary drivers for that, which could be equipment, staff use of the system, and patient use of the system. And again, these basically come from the fishbone diagram. You can use the four, I'm going to go back again a minute here. You can use the main categories of the fishbone as essentially your primary drivers when we talk about equipment or people. There may not always, as I said before, be a one-to-one relationship between the change ideas and the drivers. Systems are complex, so one change might affect more than one driver. For clarity and objectivity, really drivers should not include measure concepts or verbs such as reduce or improve. Your verbs are going to come over here in your change concepts. The change concepts should be very specific and very actionable. Check batteries at the beginning of the shift. assign meal and change of shift coverage. The change ideas then provide the basis for your PDSA cycles or small tests of change. The teams may have many change ideas or possible solutions, and that's good. That's what we want them to have. But once you get them all, you need to start to prioritize them. You can ask the team to assess each change idea for the ease of implementation. Will it be easy or hard? Will it cost a lot of money? Can it be done soon? Is there a way we can test this tomorrow or next week, or is this a longer-term project? How many people will need to be retrained or educated? So, and then to assess the impact on the aim. Will it have a low or a high impact on the aim? How much will the change idea affect the problem, the aim, or the outcome measures? And you want the team to start with those high priority change ideas that will have A, a high impact on the aim, and B, be easier to implement. If you can find something that has a high impact and is easy to implement, you can have a quick win, which energizes the team and moves things forward. So this is really a team exercise. The ideal is you need to get everybody who is familiar with different aspects of the system involved. It also helps involving others also helps in creating buy-in for them. They are likely to have valuable insights that you'll want to incorporate into it. And there's lots of ways to do that. Number one is a brainstorming session, but there are other ways as well. Driver diagrams are useful at almost all stages of the PI process. We've talked mostly about doing a driver diagram up front in terms of designing and testing solutions, but they can also be useful in implementing and sustaining change and in spreading the change, because you can go back to your driver diagram, look at your changes, and talk to the team about how we're going to spread those. Everybody needs to be clear on the aim before you start. We do this on paper, and I have an example in a minute to show you. And again, we can use those ideas brainstormed from the fishbone. One of the things that I hear a lot from people about driver diagrams, especially if they've already completed a fishbone, is that they don't see the value in it. They feel like they've already done that work. But if you encourage them to reference the fishbone diagram and use the causes that were identified in the fishbone to think about improvement strategies and actions, that helps them to see the value in the driver diagram. Similar to what we talked about last month, you want to do it on paper so that everybody can be involved. If you're having a brainstorming session, the Post-it notes are a good idea. Everybody can write their ideas down without judgment and place it in the appropriate categories. This is very helpful if people are rushing to judgment about ideas, or if some team members are feeling intimidated and reluctant to speak up. It can also be posted on a unit or in a department on the bulletin board so that people who couldn't attend the meeting can offer feedback, because again, you might get some valuable insight from somebody who has a different perspective on the problem and the aim. I think that about covers the content that I have. Do you have anything